Join us this new year for new conversations at the Commonwealth Club.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's event at the Commonwealth Club of California. My name is Melissa Kane. I'm a journalist and an author here in the Bay Area, and welcome to today's program. I'm pleased to be joined by E.J. Dionne and Miles Rappaport to discuss their new book. It's called 100% Democracy, The Case for Universal Voting. Dionne is a columnist for The Washington Post and an author, and Rappaport is a senior practice fellow in American democracy for the Ash Center for Democratic Governance and Innovation at Harvard Kennedy School. That's a mouthful. He is also the former Secretary of State for the state of Connecticut. In 100% Democracy, Dionne and Rappaport make the case that if Americans can be required to pay taxes and serve on juries and occasionally go to war, then it stands to reason they can be required to be asked to vote. By treating voting as a universal right and a social obligation, they argue we'll be able to vastly reduce voter suppression and foster a more democratic society and align closer to the country that was envisioned in the Declaration of Independence. Across the next hour, we're going to discuss the importance of voter participation and the benefits the country could reap by ensuring every voice is heard. If you're watching along with us online and you have a question, just put it in the text chat on YouTube and we will get to them later in the program. And so now I will turn it over and allow these gentlemen to begin. Welcome, Mr. Rappaport and Mr. Dionne Jr.
Thank you. It's so great to be here with you again, because your conversations with you are so great. And the Commonwealth Club has been an amazing venue for such a long time for good ideas and contested ideas. And so it's a real honor for both of us to be here.
We're so glad to have you.
Indeed. Thank you for having us.
So tell us about this project.
So first of all, it's been fun to work with my friend Miles. I always say that Miles has so much energy that if Europe could just tap all of Miles' energy, they wouldn't need another drop of Russian oil. And it's true. But we started this with a working group because we thought that this idea, which has been in effect in Australia for 100 years. So if you want a proof of concept, 100 years is pretty good. And it's worked really well there. The idea that every citizen is required by law to vote. We believe it solves two big problems, and we don't pretend it solves every problem in our democracy, but we think it puts us on the road to solving a number of them. First big problem, most of our elections are like a fancy dinner party because we have an A list of likely voters that all the politicians and all the political consultants pay lots of attention to, and then B and C lists of voters who occasionally vote or may not vote at all, and citizens who might not even be registered. This has a number of really negative effects on our politics. For one thing, parties spend a lot of their time trying to mobilize their own voters. In the process, spend enormous sums of money to get their people to the polls, to have voter protection. But the other thing they do is they try to discourage the other side from voting. It creates even more negative advertising than we would see because they try to turn supporters of the other side into, oh, gee, we might have voted for that person, but they're terrible. Look at those ads. And so we think that this system, Harry Bosch, the great detective hero in Michael Connelly's novels, has a great slogan that I think sort of reflects our idea. Everybody counts or nobody counts. And our idea is that everybody should count. The second reason we embrace this is because of these voting wars all over the country and these voter suppression efforts that popped up again after the 2020 election. As you know, we write in the book about 2020, and it was really a great victory for American democracy. 66.7% turnout was a record, and we think we should do better. But in the middle of a pandemic, because we made it easier for people to vote all over the country, people responded. Joe Biden got a lot more votes than Hillary Clinton did, but Donald Trump got more votes than he got the first time. Americans came out. And now you have these efforts to make it harder to vote again. Why would we want to do that? If you declare voting a duty akin to jury duty, it becomes the job of every public official, everybody running campaigns, to make it as easy as possible for citizens to do their duty. So we have what we call gateway reforms, which are designed to make 100% democracy work.
Excellent. And Mr. Rappaport, I mean, you were the Secretary of State in Connecticut. You certainly saw this firsthand as, you know, the person in charge of making sure elections are done freely and fairly. Talk about how you got to be part of this project.
Right. Well, I think EJ and I share a fundamental trust and belief in the democratic process and in having all voices heard. And I should say it's been a complete delight to work with EJ on this project. He's been a really, really great partner to have. So
Thank you.
Not to mention he's a pretty good writer. Anyway, but I have been working both as in the state legislature in Connecticut, as Secretary of the State in Connecticut, as the president of Demos and Common Cause for probably close to 40 years on trying to advance voting rights, expand our democracy, make it as even a playing field as possible. And all the reforms that I have worked on, and many people have worked on, in what I think is a kind of strong and robust and growing democracy movement in the country, same-day vote registration, pre-registration of 16 and 17-year-olds, restoration of voting rights for people with felony convictions, expanded mail-in voting, early voting. You know, I think they're really all good, and they have all moved the needle. But if you think about it, not enough, in my mind. You know, as EJ said, in the 2018 midterm elections were a record for midterms at 50% turnout, and the presidential election of 2020 was a record for presidential elections at 66.2. So great that there were record turnouts, I agree, especially in a pandemic, but it's sort of nothing to write home about. So I started to think, after all this time of working on these issues, is there something that really could move the needle in a serious way? And then in 2015, I read a piece that E.J. Dionne and his colleague at Brookings wrote about universal voting, and it was sort of like a light bulb. Sort of like, why haven't I thought of this before? Why didn't I think about this before? And I got really, really interested in it. So EJ, as EJ mentioned, we had this working group. We studied it for 2 years. We came out with a report. And then, lo and behold, we got a call from Diane Wachtel, who's the publisher of the New Press, saying, we've been wanting somebody to write this book, for 5 years. Would you two be willing to do it? And we said, absolutely. And we worked on the book. It was a labor of love. Here it is, and we're delighted to be. What we really want to do is put the idea out into the public debate. This has never been discussed in the United States, or not really, and I think its time has come. Not that it's going to be enacted everywhere in 5 minutes, but if we put it out there as kind of a North Star, I think it becomes part of the conversation. That's what we're hoping to do.
Well, what is, I know you talked about timing of this, and how the 2020 election was a big part of why you wanted to have this conversation. But at the same time, I have to say, when I first saw this book, I thought, oh boy, we can't even get people to get vaccinated. It's like, people don't like being told what to do. And I think we've seen that pretty clearly over the last couple of years. I mean, are you concerned at all that there will be sort of a knee-jerk reaction that maybe even in a place like San Francisco, we haven't really seen a push for something like this? People just are a little iffy about orders from the government right now.
I think you could say we're not only concerned, we're certain that there'll be a pushback against this idea. I joke that Miles and I are either real fools or very honest with our readers, because we did a poll about this idea. The Democracy Fund helped us do some polling on the idea, and what we discovered is 26% of Americans now support this idea. Now, I actually thought that was pretty good, given that this idea has never been advanced in a systematic way, but it also means a clear majority oppose this idea. Now, but there were a couple of things our polling showed. One was that only about half of Americans, a little less than half, were strongly opposed, which means we think starting out of the gate on this new idea, 50% of Americans are open to it. But we did some polling beneath the surface, where we discovered that a big majority of Americans agree with our underlying premise, 61%, that voting is both a right and a duty. It's not just a right, it's a right and a duty. So the premise is widely held. And we think we also asked people what they objected to about the idea. Now, the pure libertarian argument, we're going to have a big argument with ourselves. And, if people can't agree that vaccination, which might save their lives, is reasonably compulsory, we understand that there'd be objections to this. On the other hand, we have forms of compulsion now to create a fairer society that people fully accept, even if they grumble about it. Jury duty, we think, is the best metaphor here. It's worth remembering that one of the greatest victories of the civil rights movement was ending discrimination against black people serving on juries. What that really meant is that black people then became obligated to serve on juries just like everyone else. And the great civil rights lawyer and law professor said that jury duty gives the ordinary citizen extraordinary power. The same is true of voting. But then there were second level objections that we directly try to meet. Just to pick a couple of examples, you couldn't impose this on a system that also suppresses votes. That doesn't work. And so we propose these reforms to make it easy to vote. We do not want an onerous system where people think it's a big brother system. Therefore, as in Australia, the fine is maximum $20. It's not a criminal fine. It can't be criminalized. There's no interest or penalties. You can get out of the fine with an hour of community service. You do not have to cast a ballot for anybody. You don't have to vote for anybody. You can cast a blank ballot. And if I could just make one quick last point, in Australia, only about 13% of the people pay the fine. If you give any reasonable excuse for not voting, you're not going to be fined. We just want to create a culture of participation through this requirement.
Well, you do talk in the book about how to address some issues of economic inequality and other issues to make it not too onerous. But doesn't that risk it being not effective? If you can slap down $20 at the clerk's office and walk out, or not, are there too many protections such that it becomes kind of toothless?
It's interesting. The experience in Australia and a number of other countries, by the way, we mentioned Australia, but there are 26 democratic countries around the globe. So in Europe, in Africa, in Asia, and in Australia, obviously.
And South America.
And South America, a lot of them, that's right. That use this with various forms of enforcement and various levels. And what the studies show is that even a modest level of enforcement makes the turnout go way up. In the case of Australia, again, it's a $20 fine, but when they imposed it, when they first enacted it, their turnout went from 60% to 90%, and it has stayed there for 100 years. In 2019, which was the last national elections there, 96.3% of the people in Australia are registered to vote, and then 92% of those people voted. So when EJ said only 13% of the people, it's 13% of the non-voters, which is less than 1% of the actual voting population. So this light touch, we don't want to be punitive, but we think that a light touch enforcement is enough to really make this succeed.
Now, and one of the other things that is some great statistics in here, really, really fun to dig into. But one of the things that I saw is that some of the biggest opponents of this and the people who don't necessarily see voting as a duty are, not surprisingly, people who don't identify with either party or who maybe aren't even sure of their own political persuasion. And so isn't part of this issue getting people inspired to vote? In terms of getting people to want to vote and feel like they have a connection, because what I see in the numbers is people who don't feel like they have a home in either party. And so they're sitting things out and maybe don't feel like it's that much of an obligation to turn out. And so why not address that problem, which is, the lack of enthusiasm among certain people as opposed to making it mandatory?
Well, let me jump in on this because it's really interesting, because I think one of the ways in which people get distanced from the system or not part of the system is they don't get communicated with. So I had 11 elections for state legislature and the Secretary of State. And when I went, I love to go out door knocking. And when I went out door knocking, I was given a list that had both the registered voters and then a check mark if they were prime voters, meaning people who always come out. And I was told by my campaign people, if you see people on the street who are sitting there, if they're not on your list as prime voters, don't talk to them because they can't help you. And so I think it becomes a vicious cycle where people who are outside of the process, who aren't going to vote, they don't get mail, they don't get advertisements, they don't get candidates going to their door, they don't get political parties, calling them on the telephone. And so the idea is that if you know as a candidate or as a political party that everyone is going to vote, you have to talk to everybody, you have to tailor your message to everybody as opposed to that narrow list of your own supporters, and make sure you get few more of them than the opponents. But if you have to really talk to everyone, and then once people are in the process and they get the information, and frankly, if they know they're going to be required to vote, they take the information, they learn, they become greater citizens. So I think this can help to create an upward cycle, a virtuous cycle.
Every time Miles tells this story, I feel obligated to say it's the only thing he says I don't fully believe, because knowing how warm Miles is, I knew he talked to those non-voters, and that his campaign sort of staff had to pull him away and say, no, talk to the people who are number ones on the list over here. But I think that Miles made an essential point, I think, from our argument, which is suddenly all these people who are left out from the beginning of a campaign are communicated with, but also in the Australian experience and the experience in other countries shows that those voters take their obligation very seriously. We quote Kim Beazley, who was the ambassador of Australia to the U.S., was a leader of the Labour Party. He's been standing at polls since he was a kid because his dad was in politics. And he said, you can tell the people who come who are political junkies who'd vote no matter what the system is versus people who are less engaged but are voting in part because they're required to. But he said, when you talk to them, they engaged with the election because they had to, and then they put some thought into why they were making the choice they were making. So my favorite photo of voting in Australia are 4 surfers in their wetsuits at near Bondi Beach with their surfboards next to them in the polling booth, dutifully casting their ballots. And then they looked like they were going to jump right back into the surf. It affects everybody. This is part of life, and we are telling folks, take this seriously, and you should be taken seriously as well.
Well, one of the things that you talk about in terms of logistics and kind of technically how this would work is that, primaries are a little iffy. They're different everywhere, and they might not be included in this compulsory. Maybe we just have general elections. But isn't primaries the problem? I mean, aren't they part of what gets you to a choice between 2 undesirable people? According to people who don't vote, they go, well, we got a crazy person on this side and a crazy person on this side, and I don't want to vote for either of them because there's such a low turnout in the primaries. You end up with these distilled versions of each end of the political spectrum, which also turns people off. I mean, isn't there something we can do about primaries where it might actually be really helpful to have more people involved?
2 things, and I want Miles to take this up as former secretary of the state in Connecticut. You learn all kinds of things writing a book. It's the only state in the union where the title is Secretary of the State.
State.
Who knew?
I apologize.
But no, don't, it's not on you. I've said it wrong for the entire time of our partnership until recently. We discussed this at great length for the very reason you said, not only between ourselves, but with our working group. And we just decided that partly there are limits to how much voting you can require. And one of the things we talk about in the book, although we don't sort of declare this must be done, we have an awful lot of elections in the United States at every level that we should think about. Are there ways of consolidating elections? Each of us probably favor various reforms for primaries. Both of us, I think, are in favor of the instant runoff, for example, which we think helps give voters more way of having their voices heard. Pick your first choice, but then if that candidate fails, your ballot goes to your second choice. There are a lot of reforms like that. We just decided that there were limits as to how much this one idea could sort of carry out. And we have a last chapter in the book where we say, look, there are a lot of other reforms our system needs. We don't want to pretend we are like those 19th century elixir salespeople saying this one idea will cure all that ails you. But we agree fundamentally, we want to encourage a broad discussion about how to fix our democracy.
Well, and that goes to the question of, how this might be implemented, at the local and state level. I mean, it is possible to imagine a piece of federal legislation, that would require voting as for federal elections. But the way we really see this is that localities and states, in their kind of historic role as laboratories of democracy, as we know, would figure out through their, with reference to the election laws of the particular state, how to do this, what elections it should apply to, is there a kind of a run-up, a step-up to full implementation, et cetera. So what we do is lay out a kind of a template of basically what we believe would be the best system. And then for legislators, whether it's in California or Connecticut or Massachusetts or anywhere, they would take it up, tailor it to the state's laws, and then make it happen. And our hope is that what we're doing is kind of putting out a kind of a North Star reform to people who are working in the field, and that people will take it up as they see fit.
And you even include model legislation in here, helpfully.
Right, which I'm very proud was introduced by a former student of mine in Connecticut, Will Haskell.
Wow.
And I don't think it was because he was my student, but bless him for introducing the bill, which let us show that. And we tried in laying out our idea in enough detail. For example, we suggested conscientious objector status in good American fashion.
I want to discuss this because we vote often in San Francisco, and this is I didn't mark it yet. This is my ballot, and
So we all want to know.
This is
how
my
you're gonna
actual
vote.
ballot. This is the runoff for state assembly, and it's a special election. Our state assembly person took a different position in the city government, so now there's this. Anyway, so this is runoff. There is none of the above here. We have two choices, and even in San Francisco, where we're pretty innovative, and pretty open in the way we vote, and we've got ranked choice voting and open primaries and all such thing. None of the above, which is an important part to as you were saying, of making sure this works.
When Richard Nixon was president, he got asked a question he didn't like. He'd always say, "I'm glad you asked that question." In this case, I'm really glad you asked that question, because none of the above serves a couple of important functions for us. As a matter of principle, we don't believe that, even though we believe the government has the right, and we think it would be helpful to oblige people to participate, it does not have the right to tell you have to pick from this list of candidates. If you really don't like this list of candidates, you shouldn't have to vote for them. And we also do that because we believe legally. There's a great legal chapter in our book, and I can say that because it was largely written by our lawyers. We had a great group of lawyers who worked very closely.
It's a very expensive chapter.
It's a really it's an interesting legal chapter where we go through the case law to say what it shows is the government, as in jury duty, can compel participation. It can't compel speech. And we wanted to be absolutely sure that this idea could pass constitutional muster. We'll see. Any important ideas litigated in the United States. So we added the none of the above option. Now, this is not in the book. This is my own view. I have long believed in a none of the above option where if it ever got a plurality, it would force a new election. Because if voters disliked, again, this is not our suggestion in the book, but if voters really dislike those choices enough, they ought to be able to force a new election. But as we also have noted, the percentage of people who use none of the above in the states where it's available is Arizona and Nevada, right?
Yep.
Miles,
yep.
That it's usually 1%, 2%, 4%, but at least people should have that option.
And I think especially with more mail ballot voting, when you're going to get more people who aren't necessarily going to the polls, you might see an increase in the people who want to use that kind of option, because it's not a self-selecting group that's going to the poll. It's a more passive thing. It's coming to your home, and you do want to maybe have I was shocked that we didn't have a none of the above option. It's one of those things you read and you go, how is this not a thing already?
Actually, somebody asked us in the course of arguing about this, concerned that too many people would pick it. And both of us, as small d Democrats, said, isn't that valuable information? If the voters are sending back a message that none of the above is way more popular than the alternatives, that's a message a democracy ought to hear.
I agree. That's one of the great provisions that you have in here. That's sort of a small step, maybe to a larger. One of the other things that I saw in the statistics that I thought was really interesting was the overwhelming support for absentee voting and voting by mail. It was something like, let me just go to my little thing here. It's something like 71% of people said any voter should have the option of voting early or absentee, including 57% from Republicans and Republican-leaning folks, and 83% of Democrats. I mean, that is really stupendous.
Well,
Those are
first of all,
stupendous numbers.
I'll just say it's amazing the things you'll learn if you read this book.
Bless you, Miles.
But so we are very strong supporters of the idea of what we call gateway reforms. In other words, there are a lot of things that really are quite popular now and would really help. You know, early voting. And by the way, these have really come into more and more play. I mean, there's been a lot of attention, properly so, on the states that are trying to roll back people's ability to vote. But it's also true that in even more states, and not only blue states, you know, the expansions of the possibilities have taken place. So when I began at Demos, there were 6 states that had, same-day voter registration, and now there are 23. There are 40 states that now have online registration, whereas there were 2 20 years ago. Obviously, it's technology. And so we've gradually opened these up, and we think that they are both in really important in and of themselves, but also they suggest that what our real long-term goal should be is to absolutely have everyone participating. That's why we call the book 100% Democracy, because we really want 100% of people being part of the process.
I took particular joy in casting my ballot in the 2020 election because I got my mail ballot and I cast it in a drop box in front of Walt Whitman High School in my town, which is A, where all 3 of our kids went to high school, but B, Walt Whitman is the poet of American democracy. And I think one of the things that we don't talk about, because Donald Trump toxified the whole election process, we forget how many Republicans in the country took advantage of the same opportunity I had to cast that ballot in a drop box or to vote early. And one of the things we want to emphasize is, both Miles and I are on the progressive side of politics, but we're not for this idea because we're trying to rig elections for progressives. If you looked at the 2020 election, there were places where Republicans picked up House seats because turnout was higher in 2020. If you look at Australia, conservative parties, A, pioneered this system initially, and B, have done just fine under this system. Australia's elections are very competitive because everybody is included. So we really want to persuade obviously we think progressives who have a history of caring about voting rights ought to embrace this, but we also think that people who are moderate or conservative should look at this system as a way of putting away some of these crazy controversies we have election after election and just say, we're going to have great voter election administration and everybody's going to vote, and then we will abide by the judgments of our fellow citizens rendered honestly and with real consideration.
Sometimes known as consent of all the governed.
Right.
Not 50% of the governed.
I've forgotten, I can't remember which of us put it in one of the documents, but in the Declaration of Independence, it says that government is legitimate only if it is based on the consent of the governed. And then we have noted not 66.7% of the governed or 50% of the governed. And we're trying to get as many of the governed to consent to their government.
The other thing I think would happen, actually, if this were enacted in a state or nationally, is that all of the institutions of our society would bend themselves towards making this work. So election officials, obviously, if everyone is required to vote, it's really, you'd probably be breaking the law if you tried to prevent people from voting or make it harder for people to vote. But certainly election officials that cared about, doing their job well would put it out there and really get it out there that people, and that's what has happened in Australia. But I also think the schools would change. So, if I were a principal at a high school and I knew that every one of the graduating seniors was required to vote when they turn 18, would that make me be more likely to make civic education and education about how government works a higher part of the curriculum? I think it absolutely would. If I were an employer, and all of my employees were required to vote, would that make it more likely that I would give them the chance to take time off from work and do that? I think it would. So I think you would see, nonprofit organizations, employers, schools, election officials, political parties, all begin to accommodate themselves and bend themselves towards the assumption that everyone is voting and we're speaking to everyone and we're making it possible for everyone to participate.
Now, that brings up a good point. You talk about how in Australia it's a party, right? That people come out, there's face painting and funnel cakes, and election day is on a weekend, right? It's on, I think, Saturdays or Sunday.
Yeah.
And it's something. So we were talking backstage about how in San Francisco we had kind of tried to do something like that. We passed this ballot measure called Saturday voting or Why Tuesday, and we were going to make an allowance to do an election on a Saturday. And at the time, it was sold as a party, right? And people and voters said, okay, let's try this. Now, by the way, it never panned out. We never got the money for it. But anyway, now, do people want to have a party on election day? Like it just seems like maybe it could get a little contentious. Maybe you have no alcohol rule. I just feel like how would that, today, I don't know how that would look.
It's fun. One of the political scientists we work with called our attention to the fact, and it's in the book, that there are actually studies that show that if elections are coincide with parties or celebration, turnout goes up something like 6%. So partying is good for democracy, which is one of the most popular points we probably make in our whole book. And if you look at, we favor having Election Day, national holiday, whatever day you choose to, whether Saturday voting or, even if we stick with Tuesday, which is a crazy time, it goes back to farming rules back in the 1840s and what scheduling that worked well for farmers. And God bless farmers, but they're not a big part of our population right now. But it should be a holiday. But in the Australian system, I think the only objection to Australia is people probably gain about 5 pounds after Election Day because there is such a tradition of civic groups and school groups selling stuff at the polls. And people expect it now. The Australian Election Commission even has a sense of humor. They put out something, a friend from Australia sent me recently. The onion should go on top of the democracy sausage they put out. It wasn't a real regulation, but it's become such a part of the culture. I suppose there are alcohol rules that might prohibit drinking at the polling place, although Lord knows in past American elections there were plenty of drunken election days, probably especially after the returns come in and your side loses.
Let me just say here, because I think I think you've raised a really serious question right now. That is that our politics is extremely polarized, extremely toxic. We're worried about the kind of the continuation of our democracy, and this is not a magic bullet. But I think one of the things that this would do would be to change the incentive system, as we sort of talked about. But the incentive that you have now, somebody used a phrase that I really stuck with me called "enrage to engage." The incentive system is to churn up your base by vilifying the opponents and by scaring the heck out of the people that are on your side and making sure that they come to the ballot. And then in the worst case scenario, figuring out ways to depress the turnout of your opponents. But if if there's a different incentive system as everyone is voting, because then you have to appeal to the middle, the people who are absolutely going to vote no matter what tend to be more ideological, have firmer political beliefs. That seems to be the case. But in the middle, or in the outskirts, let's say, people are less ideological. But if you know that everybody is going to be voting, you have to appeal to everyone. So you really can't just target that mean-spirited, just get our own people out and beat them by one.
Well, have you gotten any pushback from parties? I mean, you guys are progressives, but I mean, the Democratic Party, and the Republican Party, have an incentive to keep to some degree, the turnout of their opponent low, and if you live in a place where your opponent's turnout, opposing parties' turnout is consistently low, maybe you don't want, political parties aren't, they're not blameless organizations and all this, let's just say that, and they have their own agenda and their own need to survive and their own imperative to do that. And so have you gotten pushback from folks in parties who say this is our current system, we got this nailed down?
Well, it's a great question because every incumbent who won the last election thinks the existing electorate is brilliant and should not be changed. And that's sort of in the nature of things. And so I can imagine there might be forces in various parts of politics who want to keep the status quo because they do well under it. On the other hand, collectively, we know this status quo is not working very well for any of us. And that there is the anger. I think that Miles just put a line under what is a really important point. People ask, how would this change the electorate? Certainly it would include more young people. Our election laws are terrible for young people because young people move around a lot more than older people. It's one of the reasons same-day registration has been such an important reform. We make it really hard for young people to vote. This system would say, A, they have to vote, but B, we will make it easier for you to vote. We would include more low-income people, as what the data suggests. But as Miles underscored, we'd include a smaller percentage of firm ideologues. And I think that would force both parties, even people who have very strong philosophical convictions, to broaden their appeal to voters who don't reflexively answer to their arguments. They would have to persuade them. And again, I think the experience in a number of countries shows that this system, again, what political science we have on it, probably promotes more fairness in government policy toward lower income people. I suppose you could say that's a progressive thing, but I think that's a good thing if you're fairly representing lower middle income people. It would probably make public officials pay more attention to young people, which I think we need. And I say that with my color hair here. Yeah. I think it's the right thing to do, but it would also, I think, moderate both sides in useful ways in the kinds of appeals they make.
And also, I think one of the other questions that I would have in terms of pushback from even folks on the left is this question of citizenship. You're going to have a voter roll. Let's imagine a long list. Maybe it's nationwide. Maybe it's just your state. And it's got a list of citizens, and everybody who's a citizen has to vote once they reach a certain age. Is there fear that, having that means that there are people who aren't on it, right? And so we end up in a situation where, it's not an E-Verify exactly, but it kind of can tell you who's here and undocumented and who's not a lawful citizen. I mean, is there concern about this?
Well, in addition to the point that EJ made before about the fines and making sure that that this doesn't disproportionately impact low-income people and communities of color. We also did a lot of discussion with people from the Latinx community about the issues around, what if people think they're required to vote and they were not on the list, and then have they committed, an inadvertent offense? And I think our view is that the laws should be crafted very clearly to say that inadvertent, mistakes based on the new law would not be cause for a fine or anything being imposed. There is the problem now of people in their the ID systems that we have, and people erroneously through automatic voter registration at the motor vehicles department, people can be put on the rolls even though they're not citizens. So there's an implementation issue here, but I feel confident again, that with election administration that was dedicated to making this work and properly funded. We talked a little bit earlier about elections have been so historically underfunded in this country that election administration it's far more amateurish. It's far less sophisticated technologically. It has far less security systems than it should. So I'm very hopeful, and in President Biden's new budget, there is $10 billion to be given to the states for their election process to modernize, et cetera. So I think a well-funded, highly professionalized, as nonpartisan as possible election administration could really deal with making sure that those problems are minimized, not to say, no, there'll never be a problem with the system. There's a problem with any new system that's tried.
And just to, your point is a really good one. Number one, the current election rolls contain very, 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 very few non-citizens. You know, there's all this bugaboo about, oh my gosh, all these non-citizens will vote. The cases of voter fraud in the country are derisory. They're just a tiny, tiny number. And in terms of this system, I don't think this system would have any impact at all on the issue of who is here legally or illegally. That is a challenge for automatic registration to some degree. But I don't think that this system is something that either those who worry that non-citizens will vote illegally have to worry about, and I don't think that it's something that the non-citizens themselves have to worry about. And we really try to build some careful measures in here to make sure both those things are true.
Excellent. Now, there are several questions that we've gotten over YouTube, and one of them says, why are Republicans scared of the For the People Act and voting reforms? I'm sure you both have opinions on that one.
So first, I think it's important to say, and I say this as an election official and formerly a Secretary of the State, where, you know, basically they're evenly divided. There are a lot of Republican election officials who are really working hard to do a good job. Secretaries of the State in various, states as Oklahoma, West Virginia, Washington.
Remember that one in Georgia who was remarkable.
Yes, yeah, it's a pretty good case in point. Even under duress, they're trying to go. So I don't want to, paint every Republican with a brush on this. There is clearly a faction, or within the Republican Party that is, aimed at trying to push the vote down as much as possible and maintain minority rule as long as they can. I just think that we have to rely on the fact that people of both parties believe fundamentally in our democracy, and we need to put together a majority coalition that is in favor of that. And I think we can do it. I think we can do it over time.
I think that when you look at the Republicans who have pushed for some of these suppressive measures, they're obviously responding to what Donald Trump said at the end of the 2020 election. And some of these laws really are almost surgically directed to exclude particular parts of the electorate. One of my favorites is the voter ID law in Texas that passed some years ago, where you could use your concealed carry permit as an ID, but you could not use your state-issued ID from the state university system. I wonder what they were trying to do there. So there's some of that goes on, but there are Republicans quietly who want to, and I want them to become more public, who want to say we don't need to be afraid of a bigger electorate, that Republicans can do just fine with a bigger electorate. We were just on a talk radio show this morning where an old friend of ours, Arnie Arneson, who is a politician in New Hampshire, made the point that the Democrats in Virginia passed a very open election law that made it very easy for people to vote in Virginia. And guess what? Republicans won all the way down the ticket. They used the higher turnout to their advantage. And I hope more Republicans come to realize they should just embrace full voting, and then let's have an election and see where everybody stands.
Well, if that keeps happening, I don't know what Democrats are going to
that's
change their position.
That's a whole other issue.
Well, but that's an important point I just want to make, which is, although I'm sure that we will be criticized for this, our principle here is fundamentally a small d democratic principle. I think both of us are real believers in democracy, having worked at it for many, many, many years from one vantage point or another. So, I have been asked by Democrats, are you really sure that this is going to be an advantage for Democrats? And my response is, it's not why we're doing this. In some cases it will, and in some cases it won't. But the point is, it will be good for democracy. It will be good for participation. It will be good for having a country where everybody is part of the process and not just the A list and the B list, as EJ described.
Well, to your excellent point about Republicans, you show in the polling statistics in here, at least, that it's pretty bipartisan, that there's sort of 15% of Democrats and Republicans are really in favor of this, sort of compulsory voting system. And then about the same number in each party is also strongly against. But there's not at least the numbers don't show, like a huge allergy among Republicans that, against this kind of system.
Yeah, again, bless you for reading all the numbers in the book. One of the things I worry about is our polling was done before Trump did what Trump did in 2020. And I worry how that changed. But the reason I'm glad we did that polling before anything happened is it showed exactly what you said, and that indeed people who are very conservative as well as people who are very liberal believe that voting is both a right and a duty. They were two of the strongest groups in favor of that idea. So again, this tells us that there is at least some shot at beginning to sort of persuade at least some people across party lines. Right now, Democrats seem to be the party of more inclusion and the Republicans less inclusion, but it does vary by state, and I think there are Republicans out there who'd like to be able to argue publicly, yes, we are willing to trust the whole electorate.
I have another question here. Would running public service announcements through the Ad Council, we've seen those, explaining the importance of voting help turnout? Like, should we be, are there ways to make this a cultural mandate without necessarily, or before, or kind of as part of making it a legal mandate?
I think the answer is yes. And, in our day job, so to speak, many of these things that people are doing are really important and helpful in moving forward. The platforms, the digital platforms, Facebook, Instagram, all those, even though they've been criticized for allowing misinformation to get out there, also did a really pretty good job of making sure that people knew when and how to vote, and the calendars, et cetera. I think a public service campaign by the Ad Council and others would be a great thing to do. I think that election officials ought to do public education. For this to succeed, we will need a massive public education effort. Massive public education effort is good right now, but as I said, the more we've done, the more we've moved the needle, but still not enough. So I think this is asking us to take a real leap over all of the back and forth about should we tighten this or loosen this or do this, and say, our goal needs to be, we want everyone to participate, and we're going to figure out ways to move towards that goal over the next few years.
And I have a quick question for you, just as a Secretary of State. We have another question that I think is a good idea. I'll throw it out there for y'all. How can registrars and election officials find potential voters who don't realize they can or should be voting? Like, is there a way we can send them something and say, hey, we've got motor voting here in California, but are there other ways we can reach people and affirmatively say to them, please register, you can do that, you should do that, and we're going to go ahead and notify you that you're eligible? Is that something you ever considered or
yes.
did? Maybe you did.
There are major efforts, online voter registration, automatic voter registration. When I was Secretary of State, one of the things that I did was go to all of the naturalization ceremonies in the state of Connecticut and registered people on the spot. It was astonishing. We got 90% of people who swore their citizenship oaths to register right on the spot. And I think a number of secretaries are doing that. So yeah, I think all that is good. And one of the things, this is actually in the law in Connecticut, is that registrars are required to go into the high schools prior to graduation to let people know of their options to register. And if you combine that with pre-registration, allowing people to pre-register when they're 16 and 17, you really would capture all of the high school people coming out, and that would be a big deal. Oh, by the way, I will say this: even in prisons and in people who are incarcerated, there's now a push towards making sure that they know that when they come out, they can get their voting rights back. So yeah, all this is, I think, really important.
And I think both these questions are good ones because they underscore one point we want to make about the book and one point about Australia. We wrote this book not to say stop doing what you're doing now and just concentrate on our idea. We are trying to put this idea out as a long-term goal, but we want people right now to fight for the Freedom to Vote Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. We want civic people to try to do everything they can to get everyone to participate in our democracy. We think all those steps lead in a direction where we hope at some point people will embrace our idea. The other point that those questions raise is I had two great research assistants work with me on this book, Amber Hurley and Megan Bell, who are both mentioned in the book. And when Australia does all these wonderful things to get people on the voter rolls, to make sure that they register. And Amber just was looking this stuff up, and she came into my office and said, have you seen all these cool things they do down in Australia on their elections? There are other countries that U.S. has always learned from other countries. By the way, the secret ballot, that was a revolution. The secret ballot used to be known as the Australian ballot. It was a radical idea when it was opposed. It didn't really become the law until the late 19th, early 20th century. And now we wouldn't think of doing elections any other way. So ideas that seem radical suddenly become conventional.
Yeah, and one person writes here,
oh, go ahead. You got to read it now.
all right. It's funny because we've all felt this. What recourse do voters have when politicians overturn their will? I'm thinking of Florida, which after allowing felons to vote, you write about this, right? They voted to allow felons to vote, and then that was thwarted by some additional regulations that the state legislature put on top of that. So we had a voter enacted reform that was sort of undermined by, sort of state politicians. This is the kind of thing that makes people not want to vote.
This reader will like our book because we write about that. Miles, why don't you take it, because you were very involved in some of this stuff.
Well, I do think that the Florida example is a wonderful case in point, because there was just an enormous grassroots effort, which was quite bipartisan, to get the ballot initiative passed, Amendment 4 to the Florida Constitution. And then the legislature absolutely undermined it by saying, well, you have to pay all of your fines. And of course, they had very terrible records. People couldn't even find out how much they owed. So of the 1.2 million people who should have gotten their rights back, which was an extraordinary number, maybe 100,000 or even less actually ended up voting. But still, it was still a step. So, yeah, I think that the recourse that people have is to vote those people out in the next election. And if everybody can vote, there's more likelihood that they'll be turned out if they undermine the will of the voters.
I think there is this real problem that's been going on in the country where when voters pass a referendum, and then the state legislature, I'm sorry to say, it sounds very partisan. I think this has tended to happen even more in Republican states in recent year or so. On gerrymanders, for one, although that one is violated by both parties sometimes, but on gerrymanders, on this Florida law and on others, the voters say X and the legislature says we don't care what the voters say. That's a real problem. If the legislature thinks there's a problem with what the voters said, take it up with the voters again. Try to make a case for repeal, but don't pass laws that say, well, we are theoretically saying yes to this, but in fact we are completely undercutting it, and that's really problematic.
Gotta throw the bums out. Isn't that what that's what they say? This is an interesting question. You touched on this earlier, but I just want to bring it back. Someone in the audience asked, what role will the courts play in voting reform? Because it seems like the court doesn't like laws like the Voting Rights Act, et cetera. Like maybe the Supreme Court, maybe with its current makeup, for example, might be a little less open to the legal challenge that you guys write is pretty much guaranteed to come.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, I think unfortunately, there are a lot of reasons to worry about this current Supreme Court. They have voted not once but twice to undercut the Voting Rights Act that Congress passed. And with really negative effect on our elections. When the first Shelby v. Holder decision came out, getting rid of the automatic pre-approval by the Justice Department pre-clearance of laws in states that had historically discriminated. As soon as the Supreme Court ruled, all of these measures passed that made it harder for people to vote. And then in more recent decision, another section of the Voting Rights Act was undercut. So I am very worried about the direction of this Supreme Court on voting rights, as I think the questioner is. We are very aware of the potential challenges to an idea like ours, which is why we actually devoted a lot of time to why we think there really is a strong constitutional argument that is based not on any wild reading of precedent, but on reading of the precedents as they actually are. Would I ever make any predictions about what this particular court would do? No, I would not. But I'm curious. Maybe Miles is absolutely convinced that they'll do the right thing.
No, but I want to pick up on one word that was in the question, which was courts, plural.
Yes, exactly.
I don't disagree at all about the Supreme Court. I'm very, very worried, although I think when Ketanji Brown Jackson gets on that court, she'll straighten those people up a little bit, I hope. But anyway, but the courts played an incredibly important role in 2020 during the elections. There were 400 lawsuits filed during the course of the 2020 elections. They were all different issues, but many of them were about the expansion of early voting, the expansion of mail-in voting. Could they count? Could they start counting earlier? Could they keep counting later? All of these things that were changing the rules back and forth. But I would say overall, the courts held their ground. The courts upheld changes that were made to make it easier to vote, generally ruled against kind of cynical challenges to voting laws and then afterwards to attempts to overturn the elections. There were 60 suits by people claiming that the election was fraudulent, which it obviously was not. So I think that the courts have been a good bulwark. The question is obviously there are a lot of new justices that were appointed by Donald Trump who were likely to go in one way. On the other hand, there are a lot of new justices that have been appointed by President Biden in the federal courts. And the state courts have been really, really important too. One of the major things that's happening in litigation now is that people are going to state courts based on state constitutions giving people the right to vote, and they're winning. So I'm a little better, feel better about the role of the courts overall, without disagreeing with you at all on the Supreme Court.
I've been joking that I love working with Miles because I think of myself as a pretty hopeful person, maybe a glass 1/10 full person. He's a glass 1/20th full person, but he's absolutely right. It is really, I'm so glad he made that point because it's really worth looking at the litigation after 2020. And the system really did hold up. And it's why the attack on the Capitol had to happen, is because the system held up. There were recounts, there were court cases, and they were all on the side of no, let the voters themselves make this decision. I'm really glad you mentioned that positive aspect of what happened in 2020.
And as soon as we pass universal voting, those courts are going to go back to work on our behalf. I'm totally convinced.
Well, it does bring up an interesting point in terms of not just the courts, the state courts maybe being a better place. It's easier sometimes to amend a state constitution, certainly than the U.S. Constitution, to put in a right around elections or voting, and so people might find an easier path there. But also this idea that I think y'all kind of agree, we're probably not going to get a federal law on this anytime soon. It'll probably have to happen in some localities and maybe a small state, and then sort of the laboratories are going to have a bubble up. So it may actually be played out in state courts and local courts before you get a sort of larger court case. That's how you envision this playing out?
We think an idea such as this, as has happened, for example, with instant runoffs, where the state of Maine has started to use them. It was used in the New York City primary for mayor this year. There were a lot of innovative ideas that have been tried out first in the states that spread to the rest of the nation. And that's how we think this idea would advance, although we do hope, we would love to see a bill introduced into Congress. We'd love a debate at the national level, simply to get this idea out there that, because we view it as a kind of game changer. Let's not just talk about what we can do to prevent bad things from happening. Let's envision a whole new system that could make something really big and good happen. So we want the debate at the national level, but we expect that the action, at least to begin with, will be at the state and local level.
To pay California a compliment, one kind of originally radical idea, which was to take the redistricting power away from the state legislators, who, as I well recall, were in the business of picking their voters before the voters then had to choose on them, and created an independent redistricting commission. And the California system, has worked, from my point of view, quite well. And it's spread to a lot of other places. So there are several ballot initiatives have created independent commissions in other places, et cetera. So I think the idea of finding some places that are willing to innovate, willing to take a risk on the idea of universal voting, have it prove its concept at the local level and work its way out. I think that's how we envision it. I see, I'll just say very quickly, kind of we are going to try to continue to move this issue forward with a kind of a three-part strategy. One is to really make it part of the public debate, in journalistic circles and policy circles in government. Second, I mentioned that I thought there is a real robust democracy movement in the country, but to get those organizations who are working to both defend and expand democracy to take this as one of their agenda items, not to supplant everything else, but one. And then we hope come 2023, 2024 that we'll start to see it enacted in some places, and then we'll go from there. So we'll come back. We'll talk to you then.
I hope so. We have a couple more minutes, but I did want to get to the last couple of questions here. There is a question here. Somebody wanted to know, is there a clear percentage difference between Democrats and Republicans who vote in person versus, they say online, but I assume they mean like mail ballot or not in person? Do y'all have a sense of who's benefiting from expanded mail ballot access or expanded in-person access?
Well, in the last election, we had what I think is an imperfect test of this, because President Trump himself in his campaign was emphasizing voting in person as the way he wanted to do it, because he didn't like the voter expansions that were going on. So that when you looked at the ballot counts on election night, it was quite clear that Democrats on the whole, not uniformly, but Democrats on the whole, took more advantage of the early voting than Republicans did. Having said that, in very Republican areas and all over the country, there were plenty of Republicans who took advantage of this. And older voters who particularly benefit from this option tend, at least at the moment, to be are more Republican than younger voters, and this is a particular advantage to them. So I think two answers. One, as a practical matter, in 2020, Republicans were less likely to take advantage of this, but they are by no means disadvantaged by it, and many of them used it too.
Well, yeah, I can tell you in California, for example, we know that on election night, the initial returns, because those are the mail ballot votes that get counted first, those skew Republican. And then it's actually when the ballots come in that were cast that day at voting stations and at drop-off locations, those skew Democrat. So if you're looking at the returns on election night, if a Republican's not up by 10 points or more, they may lose that election. Even though it looks good for them, they're actually, the next day, they're going to find that they're actually in some serious trouble. So I think to your point, it kind of varies.
Yeah, no, in fact, in the book, we talk about how the Trump campaign probably hurt Republicans, because what you say is exactly right. Historically, Republicans were better at mail balloting than Democrats were, and California is the perfect case of that. And what you had was Trump discouraging mail voting, which many Republicans on the ground, even when they didn't want to criticize Trump, were pulling their hair out and saying, wait a minute, this is an advantage for us. Why is he attacking it? And we talk about a primary held in Wisconsin under pure COVID conditions. It was a mess. Because of what was going on, it was the Democrats who did a much better job of getting the early vote counted. They took a judge seat, a very contested judgeship, who then ruled in the fall when the state Supreme Court ruled. This vote made a huge difference. So you're 100% right. Historically, Republicans benefited from it. They're older. Trump kind of turned that around, and a lot of Republicans were very upset.
I'll just add a very quick, really interesting statistic, not partisan based, but in the 2020 elections, 70% of people voted in some way other than coming to the polls and voting. Wow. It was around 40% on absentee ballots and 30%, early voting. So you have a situation now where voting is a much more varied process. And I actually think that makes it more possible to think about universal voting, because the more options that people have,
yes,
the easier it is if they are actually required to vote, as opposed to saying, well, I can't make it on that Tuesday, how can you ask me to vote? You have plenty of options, and I think that's a really good thing.
Right, so the law is not asking you to go to a polling place, it's just asking you to return this thing that came to you in the mail, and so it's a less of an ask, potentially for voters.
Right. The whole argument of our book is that it is not too much to ask the average citizen to play the role that they ought to play in our democracy. And right now, if they are cynical, we understand why they might be. If they think the system makes it not easy enough for them to vote, and certainly that was true before the changes of 2020, we understand that. So we want to create a system that makes people want to vote, that creates a sense of excitement about democracy being democracy and meaning everybody, and including everybody. And that creates have people ask the question, not why do we have voter suppression, but why not 100% democracy?
I love it. We have time for one more question here before we wrap up, and I just want to end with this one. So if there is one quick policy fix you could make tomorrow to help in this effort, what would it be?
You want to go, Miles?
Wow.
Sorry. Wave your magic wand and fix the world. Go.
Well, I would do universal voter registration. That is a combination of same-day registration, motor vehicle registration, online registration, get everybody registered. Mm-hmm. Then I think at least you have halfway towards everybody voting, and then we can take the next leap forward.
And I might just add to that, that would include same-day voter registration, because if we did universal voter registration, anybody missed could register on Election Day. We now have, how many states have same-day?
23 now.
23 now. This works. And so especially for young people, I think it would be especially helpful. So we'll, as we did with the whole book, we'll bring both those ideas together.
Wow, look at that. Well, thank you both so much. I think we're going to have to wrap up here, but we're so grateful that you took time out of your schedule doing radio interviews and Morning Joe and all the fancy things that you guys have been up to come and spend some time with us here at the Commonwealth Club. Many thanks to E.J. Dionne Jr., Miles Rappaport, authors of 100% Democracy, The Case for Universal Voting. And we want to thank our audience here. Our lovely audience here and the audience watching at home. If you want to watch more programs or support the Commonwealth Club's effort in virtual programming, visit commonwealthclub.org/online. I'm Melissa Kane. Thank you and stay safe.